What are those issues that you think we won't be able to escape?
Well, the number one economic issue is when interest rates go up, as they inevitably will asset prices come down, and will it be more difficult to sustain all the values that people have had over the last year and a half? I'd say the biggest geopolitical issue is the U.S.-China relationship. It's obviously not as pleasant as we thought it would be after Biden was elected. In fact, it's probably no better than it was under President Trump, maybe even worse in some cases. So as a result, I think people have to worry about investing in China or doing business with China. That's an issue. And also, what are the ramifications if the relationship gets worse? For example, suppose there's something happens with Taiwan, how is that going to affect the chip business, for example, so much of which is produced in Taiwan? So those are the two big issues, I think, geopolitical, U.S.-China, and economic. Interest rates, when they do go up and the bond buying stops, what's the impact on private equity and the stock market?
Let's dig into China a bit, because I know last year when you spoke to us, you talked about the U.S. being the best place to invest, but China wasn't too far behind on your list. Given the changes which you laid out, which have happened over the past year, which have accelerated, is China still an attractive place to be investing?
China is attractive, but it's not as attractive as it once was, I think, in part because the regulatory environment there has gotten to be much more complicated. More American companies are afraid of doing business there, and China has obviously made some steps to kind of thwart some of the efforts of some of the Chinese business leaders to be more visible. As a result, it's not quite as welcoming as it seemed to be 2 years ago. But China does still have 1.4 billion people, gigantic consumer base, and it can do very, very well for people that invest there. But you have to really know what you're doing, have people on the ground, and be very careful.
Yeah, this is something that we hear all the time, that you kind of can't ignore China, right? It's so huge. But considering some of the geopolitical tensions as well, how in general should we really view China and their place in the global community?
Well, China was the biggest economy in the world for most of organized history, and then in the 1700s, Europe came along, and the United States ultimately came along. China thinks it's regaining its rightful position. And think about this. China was roughly 1% of the world's GDP when Richard Nixon went there. Now it's roughly 17% of the world's GDP. So it's grown dramatically and probably going to continue to grow at the pace that it's been growing. The United States is not going to grow at the pace that China is growing. So at some point in your lifetime, in my lifetime, China will be the biggest economy in the world as measured by GDP. As measured by purchase price parity, it already is the biggest economy in the world.
Well, let's bring it a little bit closer to your home and Carlyle's home in Washington, D.C. The House on Friday passing the infrastructure bill. How important is this, that this gets to fruition, that this is finally put into action in order to have the U.S. be competitive with places like China?
It's a very good bill that have been passed, but I want to make sure everybody recognizes what it is. It's a 5-year bill, more or less, and over 5 years above what we'd otherwise would appropriate, it's basically $100 billion a year, which is not nothing, but it's not going to dramatically change things overnight, and it's over a 5-year period of time. So it's very important that it passed. It shows the president has the leadership ability to get something through Congress. Now the trick is, can he get the soft infrastructure bill through, which is much more politically difficult.
Right, and part of that difficulty also has been taxes. Some of the proposals, higher corporate tax, the cap on salt, lifting that as well. How do you see that discussion evolving? Is it going in the right direction?
I don't think that they can pass the soft infrastructure bill or the Build Back Better bill with taxes increases in there. I think it's very unlikely you'll have anything except marginal tax increases. I just don't see that being able to get the support in the Senate. So because Senator Sinema and Senator Manchin are not really in favor of these big tax increases, I suspect it'll have to be paid for in other ways.
And so what are those ways that you can pay for it and still have a constructive business environment?
Well, what people like to do when they want to pay for something in Washington but don't want to raise taxes is they say we'll have higher economic growth. So you'll probably get projections of higher economic growth,
right?
Maybe some greater IRS enforcement, and then trying to find money in places that it was not spent before. So, for example, COVID has some money that was not spent. They'll take some of the COVID money and apply to this. So there are some games that people play. And remember, one of the things you're talking about with these kind of bills is this is 10-year spending. And one of the easiest things in the world to do is to say, we're going to spend money in the years 1, 2, and 3. We'll make it up by getting taxes back in years 8, 9, and 10. But that never shows up. That never actually happens. So the 10-year budgeting system we have allows us to get really big deficits and big debt. When the Budget Act of '74 was passed, the debt of the United States was under $1 trillion. Now, since we've had this Budget Act, the debt is now roughly $29 trillion.
Right.
So the system we have isn't really working to keep the debt and deficit low.
Right. You mentioned the hope and often the political hope for economic growth. David, we have just about a minute left, but Are you confident about the growth trajectory of the U.S.?
I think we have a pretty good situation coming out of the recession, or not the recession we had before. I'd say the COVID situation was helped by the enormous spending by the Congress and the Fed's easing up of interest rates and bond buying. As we get out of that program, I suspect you'll see some asset prices go down a bit. I think the U.S. economy is in reasonably good shape, and I don't worry about a recession in the near term.